Chomolungma, goddess mother of the mountains, Tibet's highest peak. Known to us as Mount Everest, and occupied Tibet as a part of China.
For 2,000 years, Tibetans were independent and free.
But since 1950, Tibet has suffered the worst torments in its history.
This is Tsurphu Monastery in central Tibet, center of the main school of Tibetan Buddhism, the Karma Kagyu.
In 1966, it was completely destroyed. None of its 900 monks survived here.
But in 1980, 5 monks began to rebuild it. Life returned to the ruins. Despite Chinese repression, a new generation of young Tibetans is eager for the teachings for which their relatives were murdered.
Their leader is His Holiness Gyalwang Karmapa, who died in exile in 1981. The monks want to rebuild the monastery for his next incarnation.
A difficult task. Not only do the Chinese try to cut off the supply of timber for rebuilding, but Buddhist teachers still alive who have the old knowledge and wisdom are also very rare. Only a few monks escaped the communist massacres, either by going into hiding or by abandoning their spiritual calling. 2 of the survivors came to Tsurphu at the request of the younger monks. Now, they are imparting their wisdom to a new generation.
We can't say when we'll finish the work here, but it is the wish of our leader, the Venerable Drupal Dechen Rinpoche, that everything must be as it was before the destruction. We hope we will live to see it done. The motivation of everyone working here is clear, strong, and purely religious.
In 1982, the monks received permission to rebuild from the Chinese. Since then, a Tibetan bookkeeper has kept track of every donation and every hour of work done, by order of the Chinese officials. He knows exactly where the money and the materials come from.
Drupal Rinpoche returned from exile in India in 1984 to direct the rebuilding. We only received a small government subsidy at the beginning. Therefore, Rinpoche travels for months at a time through northern and eastern Tibet to collect donations as he is doing now. The people give mainly butter, cheese, sampa, rice, yaks, horses, sheep, and also money.
We set off to look for him. Tibet is as large as Western Europe, but there are hardly any roads.
So it will not be easy to find Rinpoche, but the farmers know him. They have heard of his work even in regions far from the Tsurpu Valley.
I live from the sale of grass and clay for brickmaking. Others give more for the monastery than I can.
The terrible starvation caused by collective farming became a thing of the past ever since the Chinese allowed the farmers to work independently again. Today, they produce a surplus of barley as they did before the Chinese occupation.
We do everything we can to preserve Buddhism. Everyone gives something for the reconstruction of the monasteries, even if it is only a pittance.
What do you get out of the reconstruction of the monastery?
You can call it superstition, or you can see the monastery as a social institution, depending on your way of looking at things. The High Lamas have fled to other countries. We who stayed behind are doing everything here in the hope that they will return someday. We're not helping the monastery just to improve our own standard of living. We're doing it in order to save our channel to the spiritual world in which we trust. Everyone has a monastery to which he feels he belongs, even when it is in ruins.
9/10 of all former monasteries are still ruins,
or are used for other purposes.
Only 25 years have gone by since the communists forced their way in here, abducted and murdered the monks, and forced the people to destroy their beloved sanctuaries.
The order came from Mao Zedong. He had the delusion of substituting himself for Buddha.
To replace the religious with the material in Tibet.
He attempted to obliterate spiritual by military power.
By 1966, more than 6,000 monasteries were ravaged, each once a school or university. The Chinese destroyed 93% of these schools and killed nearly all the monks.
The Chinese aim was to wipe out the intelligence of the Tibetan people.
To date, more than 1 million Tibetans have been murdered or starved to death in concentration camps, and the terror still goes on. We know nothing about what happened to the lamas of that time.
This generation does not even know what their monastery looked like.
Much less of what was taught there.
The search for the Rinpoche of Tsurpu proves to be difficult.
Tibet, made up of the three provinces Ulsan, Amdo, and Kham, is 10 times larger than Great Britain.
The few roads are passable only by jeep.
The yaks are the best means of transport because they don't need roads. They provide milk, butter, meat, fur, wool, medicine, and many other things. They are the least demanding cattle on earth, able to live at an altitude of 12,000 feet. Tibetans could not exist without them.
Was the Rinpoche of Tsurpu here?
He was in the village over there.
Did you see him?
I didn't myself, but my family did.
Why do you wear a picture of the Dalai Lama on your head?
He is my protector.
This mountain marks the border between Ulsan and Amdo, the northern province of Tibet.
Here, at last, are the nomads who await the Rinpoche.
In this uninhabited area, it's a mystery where these people come from.
The sun is hot, the wind biting cold, and in the morning the ground is frozen.
Far away in the steppe, a truck appears bearing the Rinpoche.
It is said that his blessing has such great power for well-being that even animals benefit from it.
The Rinpoche visits as many places as possible.
Therefore, his stops are sometimes very brief, but of the utmost importance to the people. Often there is only time for a quickly improvised ceremony with prayers for long life, peace, or good health.
Depending on what the people ask for.
What is this?
Monks hand out red cords as a symbol of blessing and protection. consecrated milk is also distributed, so that the blessing can be bodily integrated.
As I perform the rituals, I concentrate on the wish that all beings, our mothers and fathers, whose number is as infinite as space, may receive goodness, happiness, and joy. We are rebuilding the monastery with the conviction that all beings who are contributing to it, directly or indirectly, even those who have no link, will be cleansed of all negativity, that their merit will increase, that they will have long lives, and, after death, will not be reborn in any lower realm. I put my whole strength into these prayers.
With this blessing, and in the spirit of selflessness, the people donate generously.
But ostentatious givers receive no merit.
In contrast to the compulsory taxes of other countries, the giving of donations has always been practiced in Tibet. The main difference here is that everyone decides for himself how much he can and will give.
The nomads help to erect the tent for Rinpoche and his 10 companions. Sometimes they have to repair it in the icy wind. The tent serves as living, sleeping, and eating quarters. The ceremonies are also held in there.
For 19 years, the Rinpoche meditated in strict retreat in order to incur the positive and peaceful energies of the universe, a capability which his followers experience directly.
Where the Rinpoche has been, they say, there is less bad weather, there are better crops, and harmonious families.
At the same time, making donations is a spiritual practice which one of the nomads explains this way.
To attain Buddhahood, we gather on the one hand merits of selflessness by making offerings, and on the other, we gather wisdom in the knowledge that everything we offer, I mean all material things, do not really exist.
The giving of donations has a philosophical background based on the Buddhist view that matter is not objectively existent. This is familiar in the West only in the sophistication of advanced science. Such concepts are commonly discussed in Tibet. Wherever Tibetans encounter a manifestation of a higher consciousness, such as a statue, a mountain, or a Rinpoche in a tent, they circle around it to express their respect.
Unconditional love and compassion are the way to enlightenment. Never cut yourself off from compassion and love. If you are dealing with matter or with life, do it with love. This is most important. It is the seed of enlightenment. This attitude is in harmony with nature and therefore always the right one. Because you have attained this life, you must use your chance for spiritual development. If you don't, you will never be reborn as a human being. This may be an exaggeration, but not everyone will be reborn in human form. In the lower realms, beings are as numerous as the particles in space. Compared to them, rebirth as man is very, very rare. And it is even less likely that one is reborn in Tibet and will have the chance to be a Buddhist. If you have these opportunities, you should use them to overcome the ocean of suffering. For this, you need a good ship, the human body. No other state of being offers such a good vehicle, and to steer it safely, you have Buddha's teachings. But if you don't use this rare chance and let your life simply drift by, it is wasted.
But even the visit of a Rinpoche cannot take the place of a pilgrimage to Lhasa.
At least once in a lifetime, every Tibetan must touch and be blessed by the Jovo, Tibet's most important Buddhist statue in the Johkang temple of Lhasa.
This means undertaking a long, strenuous journey across the vast country.
These motor roads were built after the Chinese invasion.
the main reason for these roads is to enable the invaders to cart Tibet's resources away.
The Chinese have felled over 60% of Tibet's already scant trees. The forests of eastern and southern Tibet were twice as large as the British Isles. Up to 1,000 truckloads a day depart from these areas for China,
leaving behind irreparable ecological damage. The effects on the 8 main rivers of Asia, which have their sources here, are already catastrophic.
The other reason for the roads is military. For the last 40 years, Beijing has stationed an army of 500,000 men in Tibet.
In addition, a second army of armed police, always present in the more populated areas.
Traffic in Lhasa is heavy. Since the occupation, there are twice as many Chinese settlers here as Tibetans.
In other words, the natives have become a minority in their own country. Their language has been eliminated from official use and replaced by Chinese. Hardly anything is left of the Tibetan lifestyle in Lhasa.
But the Potala, the former government seat of the Dalai Lama, still stands.
Even today, the Chinese threaten to destroy it, should the Tibetans remain rebellious. There are more than 1,000 rooms, most of which were ransacked and closed. Part of the palace has been turned into a museum, which pilgrims and tourists are allowed to visit for a stiff admission fee at certain hours.
Norbolinka, also frequently visited by pilgrims, is the park with the summer residences of many previous Dalai Lamas.
In 1959, the Chinese bombed the wrong building in the park, which enabled the Dalai Lama to escape.
Today, his residence is still intact.
Here, the Tibetans pray for the return of their beloved leader.
For them, it is a place of worship, longing, and sadness, where they strengthen their hope for freedom.
From these rooms, the Dalai Lama fled on the night of March 18, 1959, into exile in India.
But he is still spiritually present to the pilgrims.
At the very least, Tibetans want to possess his picture.
Selling these photos at the Johkang temple is risky, but the Chinese are tolerant because of the tourists.
The Johkang temple is a stronghold of Tibetan self-assertion.
It is the most sacred place in Tibet,
There is a concentrated awareness of the spiritual dimension of human life.
Before Tibetans enter the temple, they encircle the building.
Walking in a circle symbolizes the wheel of life. The living teachings of Buddha serve undogmatically to free humanity from its circle of suffering.
Generous donations encourage the monks to continue their studies against enormous odds.
The path, called the Barkor, wends its way for about 1 kilometer through the alleys of the old town. It is the pulse of the Tibetan nation.
This is where the demonstrations for freedom and independence always start.
And this is where the Chinese attack and kill.
In spite of this, it is evident here every morning that even after 40 years of tyranny, the Chinese have been unable to destroy the Tibetan spiritual worldview.
For Tibetans, life is religion, and religion is the preparation for death.
Because it is never too early to prepare oneself for death, this woman prostrates herself in order to convert any arrogance or dissatisfaction into humility and selfless dedication.
As the end draws near, her prayers for the happiness of all living beings become incessant. At the moment of death, there should be no impure thoughts or feelings left, so that her consciousness can leave her body in a clear, balanced state.
The vast majority of Tibetans are as religious as ever, but this alone is not enough to regain their freedom and sovereignty. They need the support of other countries.
A concerted demand for freedom and self-determination, the universal right of all peoples on earth.
They come to the Johkang to pray for the freedom of their country.
They are convinced that their destiny is open and undetermined, as long as they do not lose faith in their religion.
Through this belief, they remain spiritually undefeated.
The Jovo, to the Tibetans the most precious statue of Buddha Shakyamuni, was the dowry of the third wife of the Tibetan king Songtsen Gampo, a Chinese princess, in the year 700 AD. The Jovo is the most powerful symbol of Tibetan Buddhism, yet the Chinese cannot destroy it. Its very existence corroborates the Chinese claim that Tibet was always a part of China.
Here ends the pilgrimage to Lhasa.
A final offering increases one's merits and minimizes the suffering caused by the oppression.
long journey home begins, through icy wind and over snow-covered passes.
The Rinpoche and the monks returned to the monastery after an absence of 4 months.
Years of meditation in the lotus position have almost crippled the 65-year-old Rinpoche.
In Indian exile, he was offered the chance to teach Buddhism in Canada. He turned it down in order to devote himself to the arduous task here.
The Rinpoche is responsible for the food, health, and education of 185 monks. For their construction work, they receive an hourly wage out of the donations according to Chinese regulations.
As for himself, he owns only the clothes on his back. All donations go towards rebuilding. To this end, he has dedicated his life materially and spiritually.
This gift of butter sewn into a yak skin is very valuable. Butter is used in large quantities, added to their salted tea, as fuel for lamps, and amply in cooking.
So far, 3 of the 30 buildings are complete.
The Tibetans hope to remember the Chinese invasion one day only as a short, if painful, interruption in their 2,000-year history.
Removing traces of terror is part of the Buddhist attitude of reconciliation and forgiveness.
Everyone works towards this end.
In the last 5 years, 1.4 million yen were donated and spent.
But to recreate the monastery as it was before 1966, 12 times that amount will be needed.
They believe in the success of the reconstruction because they are convinced of the miraculous power of the deities.
Everyone here is sure that one day the reincarnation of their head, His Holiness Gyalwang Karmapa, will return here.
3 rooms have already been prepared for him. They contain statues of the 16 incarnations in which he has returned to Earth since the year 1110. There is a photograph of him in his last reincarnation.
Many thousand families in Tibet have close links to Karmapa and have always given generously to the monastery. Their faith in Buddhism was greatly strengthened when Karmapa sent me back to Tibet to rebuild the monastery. The people here donate and help just as before. Their faith and determination have not waned. On the contrary, they have become stronger.
This is the place where, 800 years ago, the building of a monastery in the Tsurpu Valley was begun. The first Karmapa sat for years in this small building, meditating on the mysteries of the mind.
These mysteries are performed symbolically through the Lama dances at the Buddhist festivals in order to invoke spiritual awareness in the individual.
Restoring the cultural heritage is as important to the Rinpoche as the physical rebuilding. He also uses donations to acquire these costly robes and ritual objects.
This is only a rehearsal. When the great ceremonies are performed, thousands of people come to Tsurpu.
Nema, a former monk and the dance master of the monastery, is the only person here who survived the Chinese terror.
When His Holiness Karmapa left Tsurpu, many monks fled with him to seek him. The rest of the 1,000 monks fled during the next few years. But in 1959, I promised to stay here as long as the monastery existed. That's why the Chinese have been persecuting me ever since. At that time, my mother was still alive. I told her to flee with my brother. There was chaos here. Everyone tried to escape. Most people fled with only a handful of grain. Beside myself, there were my master Dechang Kushu, Umsu Agu, and Chopan Penshola. We tried to save as much as possible here. In 1966, half dead from hunger, I disguised myself as a beggar and went to Kimolong, where I survived. Shortly thereafter, I heard that the monastery had been completely destroyed.
Other monasteries have become tourist attractions that are highly profitable to the Beijing government, and were therefore rebuilt with more aid from the Chinese.
But most monasteries get nothing at all.
Though not the government's intention, restoration work is nonetheless in the Tibetans' interest, helping to revive and preserve their culture.
Although the Chinese view the monks as living museum pieces, the monks themselves continue their studies with great seriousness.
Free of family ties and spiritually incorruptible, they strive to preserve Tibetan culture and traditional wisdom through these troubled times.
A gaping wound.
For Tibet, this monastery was the equivalent of a university like Oxford.
But 3,000 monks were murdered here, and life is only slowly returning to the ruins.
The Canadian professor of sociology, Ronald Schwartz, learned the Tibetan language in order to study the political situation in the monasteries at first hand, and with as little surveillance as possible. He is one of the first Westerners able to do his research without any help from the Chinese.
For them, the monasteries are very much the center of the highest and also the deepest aspects of their culture and tradition. And really without these monasteries and without the kinds of study and meditation and teaching that goes on in these monasteries, there really isn't a Tibetan culture. There really isn't a Tibetan tradition.
Chinese communist propaganda declares that this culture is no more than a life of monastic parasites exploiting the peasants. Freeing the people from this burden was the excuse for their colonialization and terror.
Among the Chinese, communism has already eradicated any understanding of the values and teachings of these Buddhist books.
The monasteries were and still are the universities of Tibet.
Here, monks and nuns from all strata of society, from the poorest nomads to the nobility, receive an identical education. The respect shown to a monk or a nun depends on the individual's personal development, not on his or her family connections.
Class privileges were unknown at these universities.
It was the Chinese who introduced the rule that families must pay for their relatives in the monasteries.
This regulation cut poor people off from the only source of Tibetan education.
The wisdom and knowledge gained there over the last 1,000 years should be a heritage for all humanity.
Just as technology was emphasized and developed in the West and benefits the entire world today.
While the West developed the outer,
the Buddhists explored the inner dimensions and reached an advanced level of awareness.
One can also sit in a cave in order to practice religion. That is Buddhism too. But Buddha himself said, if there are no monasteries, there is no method in the practice, no initiation, and no development in the teachings.
To develop with patience and persistence. To learn these mudras increases one's merits for good karma.
Good karma is the result of good deeds.
Bad karma is the result of bad actions.
It is the principle of cause and effect. So the fate of the individual and the community is the result of their own behavior, both good or bad.
Then why was Tsurpu destroyed?
All the Karmapas from the 1st to the 16th have lived here. For this reason, the whole area is very deeply blessed. People even believe that it is enough to set one foot into the temple to avoid rebirth in the lower realms. That this extraordinary place could nevertheless be torn down was not due to the monastery's bad karma, but due to the worldwide rejection of religion.
It isn't pleasant to live in ththese ruins, but I came here to eradicate all that was negative from the past. It was my own decision to become a monk, and my parents welcomed it. When Rinpoche came to us in Amdo, I made my vows to him and then accompanied him.
You beat the drums in the ceremonies. Where did you learn to do it so well?
Actually, it wasn't difficult. I simply started, and then 2 months later, I was allowed to play in the pujas.
And how long have you been a monk?
I really don't know anymore. How long?
2 years.
Yes, since I was 9.
How often do you go home?
Once a year. But this year I haven't had time. It doesn't matter. I like being here.
The school in the monastery. The teacher only holds classes in the mornings and evenings.
What is the difference between a government school and a monastic school?
There is a big difference. In the state schools, they learn nothing about the science of mind. Here the students progress step by step until they become masters, and after that, many go into retreat in caves up here to meditate, to develop themselves individually. That's how we can offer again a spiritual path for many people.
Teaching in the public village schools, in contrast, is based only on the materialistic consciousness.
Taught in Chinese.
The so-called religious freedom proclaimed by China since 1982 means actually that no religion at all is taught in these village schools, only the objective, that is, materialistic worldview.
What are the teachers' greatest problems?
This is a village school. Our three principal subjects are Tibetan, arithmetic, and Chinese. We are Tibetans, so we find it difficult to teach entirely in Chinese.
Tibetan script is indispensable to the survival of Buddhism. It can be learned only in the few monasteries that have been revived.
These teachings are not dark superstitions as claimed by China, but the very basis for the Tibetan spiritual worldview.
The monks and their parents think highly of the teachings of Buddha. Every Tibetan believes in the religious way of life. They will continue to follow this way.
Do children come to you from the monastery?
No one has ever come from the monastery, but our pupils often enter the monastery after they leave here.
The majority of Tibetan children attend schools like this.
If they go to school at all.
If the traditional wisdom of the parents is not passed on to the children, the cultural heritage of Tibet will be lost.
The Chinese indoctrination is ruthless and relentless.
Until 1966, this was the seat of the local Tibetan government. Now, day in, day out, Chinese propaganda drones down endlessly on the people living here.
A continuous, merciless attack on nerves and spirit.
That is all the Chinese presence has brought.
And poverty. They are growing poorer and poorer because the Chinese have taken control of every branch of commerce.
Slums are hidden behind high walls. People here have emigrated from the country in the hope of finding work.
But 70% of Tibetans in the towns are unemployed. If they do not speak Chinese, they have no hope whatsoever of finding work.
This woman has 5 children. Her husband can't find a job, not even as a construction worker or a driver, although he has many years of experience in both occupations.
Do you mind if we ask you about your finances?
We are 8 in our family, and we live in 2 rooms. I don't make any money at all. Our only income comes from my wife. She used to work in an office. Now she gets a pension, a little over 200 yuan a month. But inflation is so high that 200 yuan is worth almost nothing. It's true that there's a lot more to buy on the streets nowadays, but we just don't have the money to buy these things. The number of people living here has grown so quickly that food prices have shot up. It's not because of tourism. On the contrary, we're grateful that foreigners come here. Before they came, we had no religious freedom at all. Today, there is a new awareness of spirituality throughout the world, and foreigners come to experience our religion. Through this, we have gained a little more religious freedom, and for that, we're very glad.
The threat to Tibetan identity from an occupying army of 500,000 men is increased by 8 million Chinese settlers who have been sent here by the Chinese government and given extraordinary privileges.
Chinese never lived here in the past.
Now, after only 30 years of occupation, they are the majority.
If this goes on, the Tibetan nation is unlikely to survive. They will be absorbed by millions of Chinese, and those who don't fit in will be forced to the fringes of society.
In the meanwhile, the Chinese People's Army is ready to destroy any movement towards self-determination with the utmost brutality.
Chinese propaganda claims that their army came to rescue the Tibetan people from the grasp of feudal overlords in the monasteries.
The Tsurpu Monastery ought to be the showpiece of Chinese propaganda, since it was once one of the most powerful monasteries in the country, owning vast tracts of land worked by the peasants of the surrounding districts. The Chinese claim that they invaded Tibet only in response to pleas of peasants like these to free them from the yoke of the lamas.
This young man is a monk in Tsurpu. His father is a farmer who grazes his flocks on land which used to belong to the monastery before the Chinese expropriated it. These are people who were liberated.
But their greatest longing is to know when and where the reincarnation of their great Lama, the 17th Karmapa, will take place.
We wait day and night for word that Karmapa has been reborn.
What links do you have with Tsurpu Monastery?
We have already received many initiations and blessings there. You came with our eldest son. He's a monk. And our youngest here is also going to be a monk.
And what happened to you after the Chinese liberation?
We couldn't show religious sentiments and behave honestly. We couldn't even say mantras to ourselves because sometimes our lips formed the words, and that could have brought heavy punishment. Fear and distrust were everywhere. When we lit our votive lamps, we had to cover them with pots so that no one could see them and denounce us.
The Chinese authorities bribed some of the very worst Tibetans. That's how they arrested and killed the respected and important people. Anyone they found in the monastery after 1966 was jailed. The only one who came out of prison alive was Umsa Agu. They accused me of being one of the upper class and of supporting feudalism. I was a non-person. Anyone could lawfully kill me. Only after I had married a very poor woman did they stop harassing me as a reactionary.
Nema did not resume his calling as a monk.
But today he guides young monks on a pilgrimage trail around the monastery because he is the only survivor of the former monks.
This money wall contains many priceless things.
The Chinese overlook the bodhisattva images carved into the stone.
The trail across the cemetery. The pieces of clothing scattered around belong to the dead.
This is all that the vultures left.
Because the ground in Tibet is frozen for 8 months of the year and wood for burning is extremely scarce, it became the custom to feed the corpses to the vultures as the most hygienic way of disposal.
Occasionally the birds leave behind fragments of bone too big to swallow. The relatives bring the corpse to the cemetery wrapped in a blanket.
One man, who is specially appointed, unwraps the body and cuts it up, often using a knife which belonged to the deceased.
This procedure is necessary so that the vultures can consume the body quickly and completely.
The rock here in this cemetery is a stone found only in the Bodh Gaya cemetery in India.
The place where the Buddha himself found enlightenment.
Legend has it that the rock flew over the Himalayas when Karmapa made the Tsurphu monastery his center.
This is taken as confirmation that the consciousness of the people whose bodies are disposed of here will have a better rebirth.
Another magic place along the trail is this imprint on the rock, said to be left by the back of the fourth Karmapa, and can relieve pain by rubbing one's own back against it.
This hole is a test for pilgrims. Whoever cannot manage to crawl through must have sinned in some way.
Another part of the trail is a test of courage.
After death, you will experience the illusion of having to cross a terrifying bridge. But if you have crossed the Qingzhou Kampa Bridge up there a couple of times, you won't be compelled to go through the illusionary experience. The Chinese comment on all the holy places on our path is, it's strenuous, and you derive no benefit from it. There must be many people in the West who share this attitude, or am I wrong?
The trail leads up to the highest meditation caves of the monastery, to nearly 15,000 feet.
In the West, there are people of high intelligence and great knowledge. They have invented things capable of obliterating the whole Earth and things that fly in space. But about life after death, and where they will be born again, they know nothing. They have absolutely no conception. But Buddhism has developed teachings which enable a person to determine his future reincarnation. For example, Karmapa is a human being with a human appearance. Nevertheless, he is capable of specifying his future reincarnations exactly, as he has been doing since 1110, describing precisely in writing each of his 16 reincarnations. Soon the Karmapa will be born again, exactly where he foretold, giving us yet another proof that reincarnation occurs. And it would be unthinkable, wouldn't it, that only the Karmapa is reborn and no one else?
Reincarnation is a fact for every Buddhist. This explains why they place such importance on a properly performed po-va ceremony.
The corpse is brought by the relatives to their chosen monastery in order to give the deceased proper guidance through the stage between death and rebirth.
The more a person makes his spiritual welfare dependent on external and material things, the more difficult it will be for him to leave his body in death.
The po-va ceremony helps to release consciousness from this fatal bond and makes it receptive to the state without space, time, or substance.
Once a link is established between the ceremonial master and the dead person, the master begins to invoke and instruct the deceased's consciousness.
Now it becomes evident to what extent a person cultivated serenity and altruism during his lifetime.
Last month, our 20-year-old daughter died giving birth to her first child. We made as many offerings for her as we could. We invited lamas to rituals and took her to the monastery for a good po-va. We were very glad that all these ceremonies could be performed once more. They were particularly important for her because she had such a short life and had no chance to prepare herself for death. Her baby died soon afterwards. It was heartbreaking, but at the same time we were so glad to be able to help them. Before, we were not allowed to perform po-va ceremonies.
Hey! 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 Hey!
That was the final call to the consciousness to leave the dead body, which now, like all material things, has reached the boundaries of its temporal span.
Everything non-material, such as our consciousness, or, in other terms, our self, our mind, our soul, and our psyche, is immortal. It transcends the death of the body and yet remains transitory.
The death of the body is particularly agonizing for those who have allowed their self-esteem to depend on physical or material possessions or attributes.
Buddhists seek their true nature by understanding the nature of mind and orient themselves towards spiritual qualities.
This is why death to them is a release from oppressive corporeality.
Buddha teaches that all suffering is ultimately the result of striving for material phenomena.
This kind of burial makes one acutely aware of the transitory life of the body.
The terror diminishes through the conviction that the consciousness survives.
Western burial ceremonies tend to suppress our awareness that the body is ephemeral. We leave it to the worms to dispose of the useless shell, and we take good care to hide the process under flowers and earth.
Here, the same process takes place, but openly.
Tibetans find sky burial perfectly natural. They care less about what happens to the worn-out physical husk than about their future state of consciousness.
For them, it is more important to have understood the nature of mind before death overtakes them, and to attain the spiritual qualities which will ensure their rebirth in favorable circumstances.
The same view is inherent in the teaching accompanying the pilgrimage through the grounds of Serpu.
In the devastated hermitage where the last Karmapa used to meditate, the students receive special instructions on the realization of mind.
The Karmapa succeeded during his lifetime in freeing himself from the power of the body over the mind. He was thus able to see beyond death to his next life.
He was also able to impose his mind on material things. An example of this is a stone with the imprint of his shoe, made during his childhood.
For someone whose life is firmly anchored in materialism, something like this is simply incredible.
To a Buddhist, it is a sign of highly developed consciousness.
Perceive that appearances do not truly exist. A person who has learned this wisdom and experiences phenomena merely as a product of the mind knows that they have no objective existence and that they can, as you saw on the mountainside, leave footprints in stone. As a child, Karmapa used to hop from rock to rock along the shores of Lake Lathung. In his childish high spirits, he left footprints in the stones, and because he went barefoot, you can see the imprint of each individual toe.
Evidence of this advanced wisdom is preserved in another retreat above the Tsurpu monastery. All Karmapas came from East Tibet, where they were born, to seek and develop the highest wisdom here.
This snow-covered summit at the end of the valley symbolizes that the outstanding figures of Serpu are not from the valley, but from outside. The mountain is also the valley's protector. And the river is our protector too. In its roar we hear a mantra. It is the powerful mantra of Chakra Samvara.
For their all-inclusive protection, the monks pray to the godhead Mahakala.
The Mahakala prayers were the first ones the monks offered upon their return to the ruins of Serpu.
Mahakala has the power to put terror into the hearts of those who oppose Buddhism.
The Tibetans offer their arms to him because his spiritual power is stronger than earthly weapons. Mahakala wipes away hate and passion and protects those who meditate from inner and outer harm.
His presence is prayerfully requested every day for 3 hours.
When people become too greedy with their material and bodily obsessions and repress their real spiritual nature, Mahakala sends catastrophes, wars, and illness to humanity, thus protecting the wisdom and purity of the teachings.
After 6 hours of touring the grounds, Nemo and the monks return with weary feet, but mentally awake.
Chinese doctrine condemns all this as sins against the precepts of materialism.
Anyone who refuses to acknowledge the belief in the continuity of consciousness beyond death as mere superstition is a traitor to the ruling worldview and is therefore liable to be condemned to death.
The theoretical basis for this was provided by Karl Marx.
According to his doctrine, monks are class enemies, reactionaries, and feudal rulers who should be rooted out.
The merits of their exemplary peaceful existence are denied by the Chinese.
Chinese accuse these monks of wanting to bring back the old society. And they use this word feudalism as a kind of politically loaded term. But as I say, the monks have no acquaintance with feudalism. For them, it's the old system with all of its complicated rights and obligations and different statuses and so on is really just history. What these people have experienced, however, is Chinese oppression. And Ganden, for instance, was destroyed during the Cultural Revolution. It was destroyed with the intention, that is the political intention of wiping out all vestiges of the old system. And many of these people now in their 20s, young monks and young nuns, what they remember from their own childhood is their parents being beaten and humiliated in villages and in cities, seeing their relatives, their neighbors taken off to prisons and to labor camps.
Tibetans are not submissive people.
They prostrate themselves for the sole purpose of purifying themselves and ridding themselves of egotism. Their spiritual view of the world is deeply rooted in the principle of non-violence.
Thus, they do not want to resist their present oppressors by violence.
Their resistance is their character.
Undaunted by force, they take to the streets several times a year, shouting demands for freedom and self-determination.
And anyone waving the Tibetan flag is shot.
The ones courageous enough to demonstrate against the crushing force of Chinese dominance are the monks and the nuns.
Without children depending upon them, and because they are schooled in selflessness, they are the first to sacrifice themselves for the freedom of their people and freedom of thought.
On occasions like these, Chinese civilians join the police by the hundreds in venting their hatred of Tibetans.
These video scenes were taken by a Chinese policeman. The tape was intended for later identification of demonstrators, but monks managed to corner him and remove the cassette from his camera.
The Chinese imprison, torture, and kill Tibetans who give foreigners information about events like these, or who discuss politics with foreigners at all.
Only a Tibetan in exile with an Indian passport and who left Tibet immediately after the interview could give evidence of his experiences in a Chinese prison after arrest.
An example of how they torture is my friend Tashi. They tied his hands behind his back and roped him to a hook in the ceiling. Then they hauled him up so that he hung there with his head and legs dangling. Then they kicked him in the back and broke both his shoulder joints. When we got back to our cell, he could no longer hold his head up. He couldn't even feel his body. And in this condition, they dragged him off to another interrogation. Because the communists have no religion, they have no compassion either. We can expect no mercy from them and no sympathy. If they had either, they would never have invaded Tibet.
The colonialists are doing well. Beijing rewards their oppression of the Tibetans with extra rations of meat and extra pay for high altitude.
Can you ever hope to regain your freedom?
Everything we do in this hope. That's why hundreds and hundreds of us are imprisoned and tortured every year. And still the demonstrations are going on. Everywhere our young people fight with posters. Their appeals are pasted on every wall. Here in my district too.
These wall posters publicize the Dalai Lama's 5-point peace plan which he proposed to the European Council in Strasbourg. His proposal for ending the Chinese atrocities is already a political compromise with Beijing.
But they are not even considering these proposals. This is because countries on whose partnership China depends are not interested in Tibet's freedom.
The arrest of people for political activity continues on a regular basis. People who put up posters, just within the last month, I know of several cases, for instance, of people who have been arrested and held in jail and are still in jail for nothing more than putting up posters or speaking out in some way or another about their political beliefs.
The whole time I was in prison, I never heard of anyone who had appeared before a judge or magistrate. Trials were only announced, but no trial of any kind was ever really held. The Chinese know that our principal political aim is independence. To achieve this, we will never give up our non-violent resistance. The Chinese communists can never stop our struggle, not with terror, not with torture, not with killing.
Their dead oblige the Tibetans to continue the struggle and not to give up. All the victims and sacrifices will have been in vain unless one day Tibet is free.
Let us not be indifferent to the shooting of unarmed Tibetan demonstrators. Democratic countries cannot overlook the people of Tibet. Inalienable human rights must not be sacrificed to trade with China. China must be pressured to withdraw from its colonies. A free Buddhist Tibet would be an asset to peace in Asia and the world. To the Tibetans, non-violence is not a political strategy, but practical morality rooted in their 1,000-year-old philosophy. A philosophy which does not include a vengeful God who punishes sinners. Tibetan non-aggression gives proof of a genuinely civilized nation, symbolized by their national flag.
When the Chinese leader Mao Zedong died, Karmapa held a huge Poa ceremony for him, and all the monks responded with love and compassion for Mao in order to purify all the negativity which he had accumulated. We have no anger against him. Why? Politically, Mao was our opponent, but in our religious view, there is no single creature on earth to which we are not related. For example, you and I are also related. Maybe you were my father, or I your mother, or we were related in some other way. Everyone is related to everyone else. The circle of death and rebirth is unending, and each individual has already passed through an infinite number of lives. All living creatures are as closely related as children to their parents. For this reason, there can be no enemies.
Lhasa